The Seventh-day Sabbath Church was known for its devout congregation, its strict moral code, and its tightly knit community. Elder Joseph Mwangi, a mere 35 years old, stood on the pulpit, leading the congregation in prayer. He had been a controversial appointment. Many of the older members of the church believed he was too young for such a sacred role. But Joseph had a way with words, a charisma that drew people in, and a confidence that made others believe in him. As he prayed, his deep voice resonated throughout the church, his hands raised towards the heavens. But what no one expected was that those very hands would soon be lifeless, his voice silenced forever. The air was thick with reverence. Heads were bowed, eyes closed, voices murmuring Amen in unison. Then, suddenly, a sharp gasp echoed through the sanctuary. Joseph's body jerked forward, his eyes widened in horror. A hand, firm and unwavering, drove a knife deep into his back. The congregation froze in shock as Joseph collapsed onto the pulpit, blood staining his pristine white robe. The silence was deafening, followed by piercing screams. The church, a place of peace, had become a scene of horror. Among the chaos, a man stood still, Elder Samuel Karanja. His face was eerily calm as he held the bloodied knife, his chest heaving with exertion. He did not attempt to flee. Without speaking a word to anyone, he simply let the knife slip from his fingers, clattering onto the pulpit floor. Then, with slow, measured steps, he walked out of the church doors and made his way directly to the police station. His hands, still stained with the crimson of his actions, were steady as he surrendered himself to the authorities, his lips pressed into a thin line, offering no explanation. As the police took Elder Karanja away, the congregation struggled to understand what had just happened. Murmurs filled the church. Why would a respected elder commit such an atrocity? Then, like wildfire, the whispers turned into a sinister revelation. Joseph Mwangi had been having an affair with Naomi, Elder Karanja's wife. The Seventh-day Sabbath Church was thrown into turmoil. Elders and members gathered in hushed meetings, debating how such a disgraceful scandal could have infiltrated their sacred walls. Many blamed the church leadership for appointing Joseph at such a young age. 35 was not the right time for a man to hold such responsibility. The older elders argued that Joseph had been too inexperienced, too impulsive, and too drawn to temptation. But the damage had been done. Blood had been spilled on the pulpit, and the church was forever changed. At the police station, Elder Karanja sat in a dimly lit interrogation room. The officers questioned him, but he remained silent. His eyes, dark and unreadable, stared at the wall. They pressed him for details, demanding to know what drove him to such an act, but he simply folded his hands and exhaled deeply. "I have nothing to say," he finally muttered. The officers exchanged glances. A confession without explanation was rare, but Karanja seemed resigned to his fate. Meanwhile, Joseph Mwangi's wife, Ruth, wept uncontrollably. She had known about his indiscretions, but had chosen to remain silent for the sake of their marriage. Now the father of her children lay in a morgue, his reputation shattered. The weight of grief and shame pressed heavily on her. Church members came to console her, but their words were empty. Their condolences were laced with judgment. She clutched her children tightly, uncertain of what the future held for them. Naomi, Elder Karanja's wife, became the target of hushed conversations and disapproving glances. She had not only betrayed her husband, but had also tainted the sanctity of the church. Her own family distanced themselves from her, refusing to take her calls. Overcome with guilt, she locked herself in her home, refusing to eat or sleep. The affair had cost her everything: her marriage, her reputation, and her place in the church. She feared the day she would have to testify in court, knowing her role in the tragedy would be laid bare before the world. Detectives scoured through Joseph Mwangi's personal life, uncovering more secrets than they had anticipated. His financial records indicated suspicious transactions, and his phone contained numerous messages that suggested his affair with Naomi was not his only indiscretion. The detectives began questioning other women from the church, and soon a much darker side of Joseph's life came to light. As news of Joseph's double life spread, the congregation found itself split into two factions. One side mourned his death, while the other saw it as divine punishment for his sins. Sermons turned into debates, and the once united church was now on the brink of collapse. Some members called for forgiveness, while others demanded that Naomi be expelled from the church community. The very foundation of the Seventh-day Sabbath Church began to crumble. Elder Karanja stood before the court, his expression unreadable as the prosecution laid out its case. The church members sat in the gallery, divided in their feelings. Some hoped for leniency, understanding the pain that had driven him to commit the crime. Others demanded justice, seeing his act as nothing short of murder. Naomi, pale and gaunt, took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted her affair and the events that led to the fateful day. Joseph's widow Ruth took the stand, her sorrow evident in her voice. She spoke of her husband's charisma but did not deny his flaws. He was not a perfect man, she admitted, but he did not deserve to die this way. Her words sent a hush through the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances weighing her statement. After weeks of silence, Elder Karanja finally spoke in his own defense. He admitted to the murder but pleaded with the court to understand his pain. "I acted in a moment of weakness," he said, his voice low. "I had given my life to the church, to my family, and yet I was betrayed." His words resonated with some, while others remained unmoved. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the judge read it aloud. Guilty of manslaughter. The church members gasped. It was a lesser charge than expected. Karanja was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Some felt justice had been served, while others believed it was too light a sentence. With Karanja behind bars, the Seventh-day Sabbath Church faced its greatest crisis yet. Attendance dwindled, and many members left altogether. The elders struggled to restore order, but the damage had been done. Trust had been shattered, and the church was no longer the sanctuary it once was. Elder Karanja sat in his prison cell, staring at the grey walls that now confined him. The reality of his actions settled deep within him. The warden, a stern man with years of experience, approached his cell one evening. "You're not the first man to let anger consume him," he said, "but if you want to survive in here, you need to make peace with yourself." Karanja nodded but said nothing. He had already resigned himself to his fate. Naomi could no longer bear the judgmental glances and hushed whispers that followed her everywhere she went. She packed her belongings and fled to another town, hoping to start over. But guilt was a persistent shadow, and no matter how far she ran, she could not escape it. Each night, she dreamt of Joseph, his lifeless eyes staring at her, accusingly. Ruth, Joseph's widow, refused to let grief consume her. With 2 children to raise, she threw herself into work, determined to provide them with a stable life. She distanced herself from the church, unwilling to be part of the congregation that had turned against her late husband. Though her heart still ached, she was determined to rebuild her life. Months passed, and the Seventh-day Sabbath Church struggled to regain its former glory. A new elder was appointed, an older, more experienced man whom the congregation trusted. He preached about redemption and healing, urging the church members to move forward. But the scars of the past still lingered, and many found it difficult to truly forgive. One evening, a former detective involved in the case visited Karanja in prison. "I thought you should know," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Karanja opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside were letters, love letters, written not by Joseph but by another elder to Naomi. Karanja's breath caught in his throat. Had he killed the wrong man? The detective leaned forward. "Someone wanted you to think Joseph was the only one." but there were more secrets in that church than we realized. Karanja's hands trembled as he gripped the folder. He had taken a life, believing he was delivering justice. But now, as he sat in the dimly lit room, the truth unraveled before him, revealing a far more sinister reality. The church had many sins, and Joseph's affair was just the beginning of a web of deception that would remain buried forever. Or would it?